Hello, welcome back. Okay, this is our next art historical lecture for the art appreciation class, and we're talking about the Renaissance. For those of you who are keeping track, we're actually a little bit late on the Renaissance. This goes with Unit 4, and remember, Unit 4 was paired with our first lecture about painting and with our first lecture about color, as well as a lecture about the relationship between art and religion. Okay, so some of the things that I want to cover in this lecture about the Renaissance are just giving you an overall impression of the Renaissance and what it was, what we're talking about, and then kind of ending the lecture focusing on some of the biggest names of the Renaissance, the big three of the late or the high Renaissance, and also adding Titian at the end. Okay, so probably the first point I want to make is that the Renaissance is not one single event. The Renaissance is really kind of, in some ways, two events, a Northern Renaissance and an Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance took place mostly in northern Italy, from like Rome and further north. And the Northern European Renaissance mostly took place in mostly in cities in Flanders and in some parts of Germany. Okay. And also, it's important to realize that even though the Renaissance was happening in these two locations, somewhat related but somewhat independently of each other, there was also changes that were happening in all of Europe, and that later on those changes would become really important in terms of how the Renaissance influences the rest of Europe. Okay, point number one, Northern Renaissance, Northern European Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance. Point number two is that in terms of time period, we often divide the Renaissance, especially the Renaissance in Italy, into two time periods, the early Renaissance and the late or the high Renaissance. And on top of that, also in this class, we'll talk a little bit about the period immediately before the Renaissance. And once again, especially in Italy, we'll be talking about a period that either you could describe as the late Gothic or as Proto-Renaissance, starting in about 1300 CE. Now, in the notes and a little bit of what we discussed in class, there's a lot of discussion about two major important issues, like where did the Renaissance come from, as a historical event, what were the causes of the Renaissance, but then also an examination of whether it's even fair to say the Renaissance existed or that the Renaissance is a distinct and unique event as opposed to just an extension of the Gothic. In this lecture, we're not going to go much further into that discussion, but remember, it's an important part of the class. Okay, so once again, first thing I want to point out is that in Italy, once again especially, we see the beginnings of the Renaissance far earlier than 1400 CE. 1400 is generally considered the starting point of the early Renaissance, but as you can see from these two images, Giotto, we can see that starting in 1300 CE, we're starting to see artwork leading towards an interest in the same things that we saw in the Renaissance. So most notably, especially in this, the Lamentation here, we have a scene where Giotto is trying to create a kind of a realistic sort of stage space and fit all the figures in as if as if they had room on the platform all to sit or stand there, and that interest in space and some element of realism, of a realistic space, is very much we're going to see throughout the Renaissance. Okay, so continuing with the early Renaissance, it's hard to exactly say when the early Renaissance ends and the high Renaissance begins, but for a lot of people, some date between 1470 and 1480 is pretty common. And on this slide, I just want you to see a variety of artwork that represents the early Renaissance going all the way till, let's see, the latest one is probably in the 1450s, like the Piera della Francesca paintings, which are both stunning, gorgeous paintings. Okay, so let's step away from Italy for a second and look at Northern Europe. So at the same time, we have developments going on in the Northern European Renaissance, and in there we have the developments of interest in painting as well. But there are some differences. In the Italian Renaissance, we see more of an interest in classicism, more interest in looking at classical sources and painting figures more like classical sculpture. Whereas in the Northern Renaissance, the painting is definitely coming much more out of a Gothic tradition. And but also in the Northern Renaissance, we have much more of an interest in oil-based painting materials. In fact, we eventually get to the invention of oil painting. This particular triptych altarpiece here is primarily tempera with some oil varnishes. And so that leads directly into Jan van Eyck and talking about the development of oil painting. And this is critical, more important than simply just a development in painting, because with the development of oil painting, it changed how people were thinking about color and representation of color. The range of value and the richness of colors available to painters once they start painting truly in oil paint allowed them to make paintings that were much more atmospheric and much more believable in terms of space. And when that was maybe imported into Italy and combined with the Italian obsession with perspective space and with making and understanding how figures occupy space, that we then have what was possible in terms of the High Renaissance, especially in terms of the big three: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. Okay, lastly, leaving the High Renaissance. So the artist I use to represent the High Renaissance in Northern Europe would be Albrecht Dürer. There were other artists, but Dürer is such an amazing artist, and he can clearly stand in for so much of what was good about and interesting about the Northern Renaissance. And we have talked about this Durer painting the Four Apostles before when we were in the lecture talking about art and religion. But the thing I want you just to see about Durer, we have a continuation of this interest in oil painting. That's a very Northern Renaissance preoccupation, which would then be, like I said, later on about 1500 is kind of re-imported into the Italian Renaissance. But we also have a strong interest in printmaking, and with Durer, very much an interest in being a Renaissance man, being an artist who is interested in all kinds of topics for research, all kinds of academic ideas, and exploring all kinds of different media. Excuse the dogs running around. Okay, lastly, this will be probably, I think, the last slide for this lecture before I start the second lecture talking about uh, the, the end of the High Renaissance. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of a transition period before we get to 1500 CE. So the High Renaissance begins roughly 1470 to 1480, and we see some great painting. And if all that we saw out of the High Renaissance was great paintings of Mantegna and Botticelli and Perugino, then it would still have been an amazing achievement culturally. But in a way, these artists lay the groundwork for the art that's to come. All right. Next lecture, we will talk more about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael. All right, thanks.